The sun hung low, a dull red disk bleeding into the horizon, and the wind that usually scoured the high rimrock had fallen dead. Taza stood alone, on the ledge of stone arms folded across his chest-braided hair still against his shoulders. Below him, the valley stretched quiet, too quiet. No hawk cry, no rustle of sage, no distant call of quail. The land itself seemed to hold its breath listening. He felt it before he saw it, the shift. A thin thread of smoke rose far off to the east gray against the orange sky, not from any Apache fire. Then the sound came sharp, flat cracks of rifles scattered panicked. Not a hunt, not a skirmish among kin. Something foreign, something that did not belong. His eyes narrowed. A scrap of pale cloth, torn cotton streaked with dust, tumbled across the rock at his feet, carried on the last faint stir of air. He did not bend to touch it. He did not need to. The cloth carried the scent of axle grease and fear-sweat scents that had no place here. For a long moment he remained still, letting the silence press against him. The law was clear the White Eye's troubles were their own. To step into them was to invite their shadow onto sacred ground. The Old Ones had spoken it often enough. Once the blood of outsiders touched the earth, the game trails shifted, the springs grew bitter, the ancestors turned their faces away. Yet the wind had carried something else now. A child's cry, high, thin, cut off by another gunshot. Not a warrior's shout, not a woman's curse. A child. Taza's jaw tightened. He looked once more at the smoke, the distant flashes of powder, then back at the valley where his people's fires would soon be lit against the coming dark. He could walk away. He could pretend the sound had never reached him. The land would not remember one man's choice, not yet. But the cry came again, fainter, desperate. He exhaled slowly, the breath hissing between his teeth. Then he turned from the ledge and started down the narrow trail, moving with the careful economy of a man who knows every loose stone, every shadow that might betray him. His moccasins made no sound on the rock. The rifle across his back stayed slung. He drew only the bow and a single arrow from the quiver at his hip. The sun dropped lower. Long shadows stretched across the red earth like fingers reaching to claim what was left of the day. By the time he reached the flat where the wagons burned, the rustlers had already done most of their work. 3 wagons, smoldered canvas, blackened and curling. A man lay face down in the dirt, arms flung wide. Another sprawled near an overturned crate, blood pooling dark beneath him. The air stank of powder-charred wood and horse sweat. 6 rustlers still rode among the wreckage, laughing low, stripping what remained. One of them, a thick man with a scarred cheek, reined his horse and pointed. There she stood. A woman, young chestnut hair coming loose from its pins, planted herself in front of a small boy, no older than 7. Her dress was torn at the hem, streaked with soot. In her hands she clutched a broken rifle barrel, cracked stock, splintered. She held it like a club-knuckles' white eyes, fixed on the scarred man advancing with a drawn knife. The boy clung to her skirts, face buried, shoulders shaking. Taza watched from the rocks, watched the woman's chest rise and fall, watched the way she shifted her weight to shield the child even as her arms trembled, watched the scarred man grin wider, stepping closer. Something moved inside Taza, then not anger, not pity. A pull deep in the chest, sharp as an arrowhead finding bone. He had seen death many times. He had dealt it. But this was different. This was a woman who had already accepted she would die, and still she stood. The scarred man reached for her. Taza rose. He moved without sound, shadow among shadows, until he was behind the man. The knife came up in a single, clean arc. The rustler never heard it. He dropped heavy blood bubbling at his throat. The woman spun, gasping, the broken rifle swinging toward Taza. For an instant their eyes met hers, wide with shock and fear, his steady unreadable. He did not speak. He did not need to. Another rustler wheeled his horse, fumbling for a pistol. Taza's arrow took him through the chest before the hammer could fall. The horse reared screaming. The man slid sideways into the dust. The remaining four scattered cursing, firing wild shots that sparked against rock. Taza did not pursue. He stood where he was, bow still raised, watching them vanish into the gathering dusk. Silence returned, broken only by the crackle of burning canvas and the boys' muffled sobs. The woman lowered the rifle. Her hands shook so badly the stock rattled against her thigh. She stared at Taza, breath coming in short, ragged pulls. Why, she asked at last. The word came out hoarse, almost lost in the wind that had begun to rise again. Taza looked at her, really looked. Dust streaked her face. A bruise was already darkening along her jaw. Behind her, the boy peeked out, eyes huge, wet. "You were in danger," he said simply. His English was rough, the words shaped carefully. She swallowed. "They'll come back." He glanced toward the hills where the rustlers had fled. "Maybe." She looked down at the boy, then back at Taza. "We don't know the way. The next town... We were headed to California. There's a ranch. Work." Her voice cracked. "There's no one else." Taza felt the weight of her words settle on him like wet blanket. He should walk away. He should leave them here with the dead and the dying fire. The law of his people was clear: no outsiders on the path, no outsiders in the camp, no outsiders in the heart. Behind them, the wagons continued to burn, sending sparks into the night like small, dying stars. Ahead, the trail narrowed, winding between the stone walls that swallowed sound. Taza felt the woman's arms tighten around his waist, not in fear, but to keep the boy steady. He did not speak again. The land listened. And somewhere deep in the rock, something old stirred remembering. The night had come down, hard, black, and starless, the kind of dark that pressed against the skin. Taza moved through it on foot, now the horse left, tethered far back in a cleft of rock where no scent would carry. His moccasins whispered over cracked earth, each step measured deliberate. Ahead, the glow of the burning wagons had dimmed to sullen red coals, but the stink still reached him, charred, pine-scorched hide blood, already turning coppery in the cooling air. He crouched behind a low ridge of sandstone, close enough to hear the rustlers' low voices, the scrape of boots, the jingle of spur rowels. 6 of them remained circling the wreckage like coyotes around a fresh kill. One laughed a short, ugly sound that cut the quiet. Another spat into the dirt. In the center of the circle stood the woman Clara and the boy. She had not moved from where she'd planted herself. The broken rifle was still in her hands, barrel pointed uselessly at the nearest man. Her shoulders were squared, chin lifted, but Taza could see the fine tremor in her arms, the way her knees locked to keep her upright. The boy pressed against her leg face, hidden in the torn folds of her skirt, small fists knotted in the fabric. The scarred rustler, the one with the knife, stepped forward again, slower this time, savoring it. He twirled the blade once, letting firelight catch the edge. "Drop the stick, girl. Ain't no one comin'." Clara did not speak. She only shifted her weight, putting more of herself between the man and the child. Taza's fingers tightened on the bow. The string bit into the calluses of his palm. He knew the law of his people as well as he knew the shape of his own bones. No hand raised for the white eyes, no blood spilled on their account. To interfere was to invite their poisoned soldiers' bounties, broken treaties onto land that had already bled enough. The old men had said it plain, one footprint from the outside world could sour a spring for a generation. Yet, here he was. The scarred man lunged. Clara swung the rifle stock. It cracked against the man's forearm with a dry snap. He cursed, staggering backknife flashing as he recovered. The others closed in rifles, coming up slow, casual, like men who knew the end was already written. Taza felt the pull again, sharper now, like a hook set deep. Not pity, not duty. Something older, wordless, that made his breath catch. He had hunted alone for years. He had watched kin die and kept walking. He had never stopped for anyone. Until this. He rose. The first arrow left the bow before he was fully upright. It took the scarred man through the throat. The rustler dropped without a sound, knife clattering on stone. The others wheeled, shouting guns, swinging toward the shadows. Taza was already moving. He rolled left low behind a smoldering wheel rim. A bullet whined past, kicking dust where his head had been. He knocked another arrow Drew released. The shaft caught a second man high in the chest. The rider pitched backward off his horse boots, still in the stirrups, dragging a scream across the ground. 3 left. They fired blind into the dark powder flashes, lighting their faces in brief, ugly bursts. Taza flattened against the earth, tasting alkali and iron on his tongue. A round grazed his forearm, hot, shallow stinging like fire ant venom. Blood welled dark and warm, dripping onto the dirt. He did not look at it. He only felt the small, wet place it made the first mark he had left on this ground that was not his to mark. He rose again silent, flowing between the wagons like smoke. The third rustler never saw him. Taza's knife took him from behind, quick low under the ribs. The man folded without cry, collapsing into the coal's clothes, catching smolder. The last 2 broke. They spurred hard horses, lunging into the night rains, slapping voices fading on the wind. Taza stood in the open now, chest rising, slow bow still half drawn. Blood dripped steadily from his arm onto the red earth. The wound was nothing, yet it felt heavier than it should, as though the ground itself had noticed. Clara lowered the broken rifle. Her breath came in short, ragged pulls. She stared at him across the dying firelight, eyes wide, uncertain whether salvation or another kind of death had walked out of the dark. The boy peeked out, then stepped forward 1 small step, still clutching her skirt. His voice was thin, trembling. "Miss Clara? He saved us?" She swallowed once hard. Her gaze never left Taza's face. Taza felt the words settle into him like stones in deep water. He had crossed a line he could not uncross. The blood on the ground was as now mixed with theirs. The law had been touched. The land would remember. He lowered the bow. For a long moment no one moved. Only the coals popped softly, sending sparks upward into the black. Clara took 1 step toward him, then stopped. "You're bleeding." He glanced at his arm as though noticing it for the first time. "It is nothing." She looked at the boy, then back at Taza. "We can't stay here." He knew she was right. The rustlers would return with friends, or worse, the bluecoats would smell the smoke and come looking. And behind it all, the greater shadow, if word reached his people, that he had spilled blood for outsiders, the stain would follow him home. He looked at the boy. Jed. The name came unbidden, small and sharp as a thorn. Taza exhaled through his nose, slow. "I will take you," he said again. The words tasted the same as before, ash and iron. Clara nodded once. She bent, lifted the boy into her arms. Jed buried his face in her shoulder, but his eyes stayed on Taza, wide and steady. Taza turned toward the rocks where his horse waited. He did not look back to see if they followed. He knew they would. Behind him, the last wagon timber collapsed inward with a soft groan, sending up a final plume of sparks. The night swallowed them. And somewhere in the dark, the land kept its own silent count. The canyon walls closed in tight swallowing what little moonlight remained. Taza had chosen this narrow slot because the rock threw sound back on itself, making distant noises hard to place. The small fire he allowed burned low, fed only dry twigs that gave almost no smoke. Its light reached no farther than the circle of their knees. Jed lay curled on a folded blanket, breathing shallow, the cut on his shin cleaned, and wrapped in a strip torn from Clara's petticoat. The boy had not cried since the wagons, but his small body still shook now and then, as if the memory of gunfire lingered in the bones. Clara sat cross-legged beside him, one hand resting lightly on his shoulder. Taza knelt opposite, working on his own arm. The graze from the rustler's bullet had clotted dark, but blood still seeped when he moved. He had cut a fresh strip from the hem of his shirt, using his knife to saw through the fabric. The blade made a soft, rasping sound against the weave. Clara watched him for a long moment. Then she reached across the fire. "Let me." He paused, fingers still on the cloth. His first instinct was to pull away. No one had touched him like this, not since he was a boy, and even then only kin. But the boy was watching too, eyes wide in the fire glow, waiting to see what the man who had come out of the dark would do. Taza let his hand drop. She took the strip, her fingers brushing his wrist. The contact was brief, accidental, yet it sent a small jolt through him like stepping on loose gravel. He did not flinch. He only looked down at the wound, letting her work. Her hands were steady now, though he could see the faint tremor when she tied the knot. She used a simple square knot the way women in her world must have taught her practical no flourish. When she finished, she did not pull away immediately. Her palm rested a second longer against his forearm, warm against the cooling night. He met her eyes then, storm gray in the low light. She did not smile. She only held his gaze. "Why did you help us?" she asked again, voice low, almost lost in the crackle of the fire. Taza said nothing. He could have spoken of the child's cry, of the way she had stood, with nothing but a broken rifle. But words would make it real, would give shape to something he still wanted to keep formless. Instead, he looked into the coals, watching them shift and settle. The silence stretched. Jed stirred, murmuring something soft in his sleep. Clara's hand finally lifted from Taza's arm. She folded it in her lap. He felt the absence of her touch more than the wound itself. Somewhere far off up the canyon where the walls opened toward the plain, a sound drifted down, faint at first, then clearer. Hooves on hardpack. Not many. A patrol. Bluecoats. They moved slow, methodical, the way men do when they know something has happened, and they are looking for the why of it. Taza's head tilted slightly, listening. Clara heard it too. Her shoulders tightened. "They're following the smoke," she whispered. He nodded once. She looked at Jed, then back at him. "If they find us, they will not find you," he said. The words came out flat, final. She searched his face. "And you?" He did not answer that. The fire popped, sending a small shower of sparks upward. Taza reached for a stick, pushed the coals together to kill the light. Darkness folded in closer. Only the dull red glow remained, outlining their shapes against the rock. Jed woke then, blinking, confused. He sat up and looked straight at Taza. "You're still here," the boy said, as if that were the surprising part. Taza felt something turn inside him, small, sharp like a thorn, working deeper. The boy looked at him the way a child looks at a father who has come home from a long hunt. "Trust," Simple. Dangerous. He had never asked for it. Clara pulled Jed close, wrapping the blanket tighter around him. "Go back to sleep," she murmured. "We're safe." The lie hung between them unspoken, but heavy. Taza stood. He walked to the mouth of the slot where the canyon narrowed to a throat of stone. He listened again. The hoofbeats were closer, now steady, patient. They would pass if the wind held right. They would find the wagons, the bodies, the tracks. And then the questions would begin. He felt the old fear rise, not of death, but of something worse, the moment when his people would look at him and see not one of their own, but a man who had chosen outsiders over blood and earth. The shame would not be loud. It would be quiet, like a spring that slowly dries up. He turned back. Clara was watching him, Jed already drifting again against her shoulder. Taza crossed to them. He crouched close enough that he could smell the faint soap on her skin beneath the dust and smoke, the small, clean scent that did not belong here. "I will draw them away," he said. Clara's breath caught. "No." He looked at her. "If I stay, they find all of us." She shook her head, once slow. "Then we all go." He almost smiled, almost. It was the stubbornness of her that had first hooked him, and it was still there, unbent. But the hoofbeats were louder now, closer. Taza stood again. He looked up through the narrow slot of sky above, stars cold and distant. He whispered a name, his grandfather's name, the one who had taught him to read a sign in the dust, to listen to the land when it spoke. The name came out soft, almost lost. The hoofbeats stopped, then started again, veering slightly, searching. Taza exhaled. "They are here," he said. "I must lead them elsewhere." Clara rose, still holding Jed. The boy woke fully this time, eyes wide. Taza looked at them both. The canyon walls seemed to lean in, listening. He stepped toward the narrow exit, then paused. He looked back once. "Stay low. Stay quiet." Clara nodded. Her lips parted, but no words came. Taza slipped into the dark. Behind him the last coals sighed and went black. Ahead the hoofbeats waited. The first gray light seeped into the canyon like thin smoke, turning the rock walls the color of wet clay. Taza moved ahead, silent, his moccasins, finding the narrowest path, where the sand was still cool underfoot. Behind him, Clara walked with Jed's hand tight in hers. The boy's steps slower now, dragging from the night's chill and the dust that coated his throat. Every few paces he coughed a small dry rasp that carried farther than it should. Taza paused at a bend where the slot widened just enough for three to stand abreast. He dropped to one knee, fingers brushing the ground. The prints were fresh iron-shod hooves, deep, deliberate, spaced like men who knew they hunted living things. Bluecoats. Not a full troop, 4, maybe 5, but enough. Their trail had swung closer during the dark hours, following the faint scent of smoke that still clung to the three of them, or perhaps the blood that had dried stiff on Taza's sleeve. He traced one boot mark with his thumb, feeling the sharp edge where the heel had bitten deep. The soldiers were not guessing anymore. They were reading sign. Clara stopped a few paces back, pulling Jed against her side. The boy coughed again, softer this time, but the sound seemed to echo off the stone walls. Taza's head turned slightly, listening. Far off, carried on the still morning air, came a low voice, orders clipped English. Not close enough to make out words. Close enough to matter. He rose without haste, eyes still on the ground. The prints veered left toward the wider mouth of the canyon. If the patrol kept that line, they would miss the hidden slot where the three had sheltered. If they doubled back. Taza exhaled once slow. The breath stirred the dust at his feet. Clara watched him. She had not spoken since the night's promise. Her face was streaked with dirt hair, tangled, but her eyes held steady. Jed leaned into her small chest, rising and falling too fast. The boy's cough had left a faint rattle in his lungs. Nothing yet but the cold night, and the alkali dust had found purchase. Taza looked at them. For the first time since the wagons, he allowed himself to feel the weight of wanting them safe. It was not a large thing, not yet a fire, but a small coal lodged under the breastbone. He had never carried such a thing before. It made him afraid not of the bluecoats, but of what the feeling might cost. A man who cared for outsiders could not stand among his own without the stain showing. The old ones had taught that shame was not loud. It settled quiet like rot in good wood. He turned his gaze away from Clara, back to the earth. The familiar trail he would have taken up the dry wash over the low saddle into the high country where no white man road lay to the north. That way was clean. That way kept the land unspoiled by their footprints. But that way left them to die. He rose slow. "We go this way," he said, nodding toward the narrower slot that angled deeper into Apache ground. The words came out flat final. Clara followed his look. The path was little more than a crack in the rock, barely wide enough for one at a time. Beyond it, the land rose sharper, closer to the heart, places his people guarded. Places where no outsider had ever walked and lived to speak of it. She did not argue. She only tightened her grip on Jed's hand. They moved on. Taza led, stepping careful where the stone was loose. Clara followed, lifting the boy over the worst gaps. Jed's cough came again sharper. Taza heard it and felt the coal in his chest flare hotter. Each step took them farther from the bluecoats' line and deeper into country that would not forgive trespass. The sun cleared the rim at last, sudden and hard, throwing long shadows across the narrow way. Heat began to rise from the rock, carrying the dry smell of sage and baked earth. Taza's shirt clung to his back with old sweat. He did not pause to drink. Water was for later, when the need could not be ignored. They reached the small stream at mid-morning. It was no more than a thin silver thread sliding over smooth stone fed from a seep higher up. Taza knelt, cupped water, tasted it. Clean. He motioned them forward. Clara helped Jed drink first. The boy knelt beside her, small hands shaking as he scooped. Water dripped from his chin. He looked up at Taza, eyes bright for the first time since the wagons. Taza watched him drink. The boy's trust had not dimmed. If anything, it had deepened, as though the night's danger had only made the man who walked ahead more real. Taza looked away. He knelt at the water's edge, filling the small gourd he carried. When he rose, Clara was already there, holding out the empty canteen from the wagons. Their fingers brushed again, brief, inevitable. He felt the warmth of her skin against his, the faint tremor in her hand. He did not pull away this time. He simply filled the canteen, stoppered it, handed it back. She took it. Their eyes met for a heartbeat longer than necessary. "If I bring you across this water," he said, voice low, "the land will not forget." Clara looked down at the thin stream, then at Jed, who stood shivering despite the climbing sun. She lifted her chin. "I know." She reached for Jed's hand again, lacing her fingers through his small ones. The boy looked from one to the other, silent, waiting. Taza stepped into the water. It was cold, shocking against his calves. He waded across, slow, feeling each stone underfoot as though it were watching. On the far bank, he turned. Clara followed, lifting Jed to keep his feet dry. The boy clung to her neck. When they reached the other side, water dripped from her hem, darkening the dust. Taza stood motionless, listening. Behind them, faint but unmistakable, the rhythm of hooves resumed. Closer now. The bluecoats had turned back. He looked at Clara. She met his gaze without flinching. He turned north, deeper into the slot. The land closed around them again, silent, heavy, and the water they had crossed kept running, carrying the scent of strangers onward. The grass stood tall here, sun-bleached and whispering the kind that hid a man from the horizon, but not from the wind. Taza had led them out of the narrow canyons at first light, crossing the last stony ridge into this open stretch where the land began to breathe wider. The high grass marked the edge beyond it, lay the rolling flats that fed his people's herds. In lean years, the small springs that never quite dried the antelope trails worn deep by generations. Ground his people still called their own, though the maps drawn by white men said otherwise. He moved low now, belly to the earth, motioning Clara and Jed down beside him. The regulators had appeared on the far rise an hour earlier, 6 riders dark against the pale sky rifles across their saddles. They rode in loose formation, not hurried but deliberate. Bounty men or settlers turned hard from too many empty winters. Either way they carried the same scent, lead and leather, and the promise of reward. Taza scooped a handful of dry earth, rubbed it across his arms, his chest, the back of his neck. The dust settled into the sweat, turning him the color of the land. He glanced at Clara. She understood without words. She pulled Jed close, pressing the boy's face gently against her shoulder to muffle any sound. The child's breathing came quick and shallow, but he did not cry. They lay still. The regulators passed within 200 yards, close enough for Taza to hear the creak of saddle leather, the low mutter of voices. One man spat the sound carrying clear in the still air. Another laughed short, mean. Then a rifle cracked once-twice, aimed at nothing. Warning shots. The sharp reports rolled across the flats, echoing off distant bluffs. The antelope herd that had been grazing a quarter-mile north exploded into motion. Hooves thundered, white rumps flashing as they bolted in a single panicked wave. Taza watched them go, feeling the loss in his gut. That herd had fed his camp through 2 hard winters. Now the grass was trampled, the trails broken, the quiet shattered. The regulators did not know what they had disturbed. They would never care. Clara's hand rested on Jed's back, steadying him. Taza felt her eyes on him, though he did not turn. He could sense the change in the way he listened to the wind, not only for danger to himself, but for the small sounds she and the boy made, the rustle of her torn hem, the faint wheeze in Jed's chest from last night's dust. The land had always spoken to him alone. Now it spoke of 3. A third shot rang out closer. One of the regulators shouted something indistinct. Hooves drummed nearer, then veered away again, circling wide. They were quartering the ground reading sign. Taza's tracks were faint. He had walked the hardest stone where he could, but 3 sets of footprints were harder to hide. And the regulators had time. He eased forward on elbows and knees, motioning them to follow. They crawled through the grass, slow, deliberate. The sun climbed higher, heat pressed down like a hand. Sweat stung the graze on Taza's arm, the wound from the wagons reopening in thin lines. He ignored it. They reached a shallow dip where the grass thinned. Ahead lay a low rise, and beyond it the dark mouth of a cave. Taza knew it well. A place his people used only in deep winter when the wind cut too sharp. The entrance was narrow, screened by brush, fed by an underground seep that never failed. Safe, hidden, but it sat on the very edge of the heartland, closer than any outsider had ever come. Taza stopped. He looked back at Clara and Jed. The boy's face was pale, streaked with dirt and old tears. Clara met Taza's eyes. She did not speak. She only waited. He felt the pull again, stronger now, undeniable. To fight here meant dying here, perhaps taking 1 or 2 regulators with him, but leaving Clara and Jed exposed. To lead them to the cave meant crossing the last unmarked line, bringing white feet into the buffer ground his people kept sacred, where no trail led and no fire was lit except in extremity. The law was plain. The land would remember the trespass. Springs could sour. Game could vanish. The elders would see the sign and know. He looked at Jed. The boy's small hand clutched Clara's sleeve. Trust still there, fragile as new ice. Taza exhaled once slow. He rose to a crouch, nocked an arrow. The regulators had circled back closer now. One rider broke from the line, spurring toward their position rifle raised. Taza drew. The arrow flew clean straight. It struck the man high in the chest. The rider jerked back, horse rearing, then slid sideways into the grass. A shout went up from the others. Rifles cracked, wild, angry. Bullets tore through the grass, overhead snapping stems. Taza dropped flat. A round clipped his shoulder, hot, shallow, tearing cloth and skin. Blood welled fast, soaking the dusted earth. He felt the warm trickle down his arm, the small, wet place it made on sacred ground. Clara gasped soft. She crawled to him, hand reaching for the wound. Taza caught her wrist, gentle but firm. He shook his head once. She tore a fresh strip from her skirt anyway, pressing it to the cut. Her fingers trembled only a little. She tied it tight. When she finished, she did not pull away. She looked at him close enough that he could smell the faint salt of her sweat beneath the dust. Taza glanced toward the cave mouth, half hidden in the brush. Then back at her. "Hangjong Kia," he said, voice low. "If we go in, I have no road back." Clara held his gaze. Jed pressed against her side, silent, watching. She leaned closer, voice barely above breath. "Then don't go back alone." The words hung between them, small and heavy. Behind them, the regulators' regrouped voices rising sharp. Hooves drummed again, closing the distance. Taza looked once more at the cave. He rose. He led them toward it. The grass parted before them like water closing behind, and the blood he left on the ground kept seeping slow and dark into earth that had never known such a stain. The cave mouth was little more than a crack in the cliff face, half hidden by twisted juniper and shadow. Taza pushed through first shoulder-scraping stone, the cool dark swallowing him whole. Behind him, Clara ducked low, guiding Jed ahead of her. The boy's small hand clutched hers. His breathing came quick and shallow, echoing faintly against the damp walls. Inside, the air changed thick with the smell of wet rock and mineral seep, undercut by the faint iron tang of old blood from animals that had sheltered here long ago. A thin stream ran down the center of the floor, black and smooth, reflecting nothing. Taza stepped aside, letting them pass deeper. The space widened into a low chamber ceiling, lost in gloom. Enough room to stand, to breathe, to wait. He turned to cover the entrance bow, still in hand, arrow half knocked. The regulators' voices drifted in from outside, distant, now muffled by rock and distance, but still there, persistent. They had lost the trail in the grass, but they would circle back. Men like that always did. Clara settled Jed against the wall, wrapping the blanket tighter around him. The boy leaned into her eyes, wide in the dim. She looked up at Taza, silent question in her gaze. He met it for a heartbeat, then looked away. He had crossed the last unmarked line to bring them here. The seep that fed this place was one his people knew by name, sacred in lean years, spoken of in the old stories. No fire had ever been lit inside, except in direst need, and never for outsiders. The law was not written. It lived in the stone in the water, in the memory of every elder who had drunk from it. To bring white feet across that threshold was to invite the land to turn. Springs could fail, game could vanish, the ancestors could withdraw their faces. He felt the weight settle deeper in his chest. Not regret, not yet, but the knowledge that some things done could not be undone by prayer or sweat or blood. A soft scrape of moccasin on stone. Taza turned slow. Nana stood in the narrow throat of the entrance, blocking the gray light. The old man had come without sound, as though the land itself had carried him. He held his staff of carved cedar, the symbols of lineage etched deep into the wood, eagle-bear the spiral that meant unbroken line from the beginning. His face was carved from the same stone as the walls, eyes steady, unblinking. He did not raise his voice. This place does not allow strangers' steps. The words fell flat heavy like stones dropped into still water. Clara stiffened. Jed pressed closer to her side. Taza stepped between them and the old man, not aggressive, only there. His bow remained low, unthreatening. Nana's gaze moved past him to Clara, then to the boy. No anger in it. Only the quiet certainty of a man who has seen too many seasons turn and knows what follows trespass. The regulators hunt still, Taza said. Low. Even. They will not stop. Nana nodded once, as though the fact were already known. Then let them hunt. The land will hide its own. Taza felt the coal in his chest flare hotter. He looked back at Clara. She stood motionless, one arm around Jed, the other hand resting on the boy's shoulder. Her face was pale in the dim, but she did not flinch. She only waited. Outside, a distant shout, regulators calling to one another, voices thinning on the wind, closer than before. Taza exhaled through his nose. He looked at Nana again. If I leave them here, they'd die. Nana's grip tightened on the staff. The carved symbols caught the faint light seeming to shift. If you keep them here, the land dies a little more. The old man did not move. He did not need to. The words were the barrier. Taza stood between them, between the woman and child who had become his burden, and the elder who carried the memory of every generation before. He felt the pull in two directions, equal, merciless. To turn back now meant certain death for Clara and Jed. The regulators would find them, or the night would, or the thirst. To step forward meant severing the last thread that bound him to his people. No ceremony could wash this away. No offering could restore what would be lost. The elders would see the sign in the dust, in the changed trails, in the silence of the springs, and they would know. He looked down at Jed. The boy stared up at him, not afraid, only waiting. Trust still there, small and steady. Taza reached out. His hand closed around Clara's wrist, gentle but firm. He drew her forward past Nana, deeper into the chamber. Nana did not step aside. Taza brushed past him close enough to feel the old man's breath, the faint scent of sage smoke that clung to his blanket. Nana remained where he was, staff-planted eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. Taza led Clara and Jed to the far wall, where the seep gathered in a shallow pool. He released her wrist. She looked at him, searching his face. He did not meet her eyes. Behind them, Nana spoke once more, voice soft as falling dust. The ancestors will remember this. He said no more. Taza stood motionless back to the entrance. Clara settled Jed against the stone, then stepped closer to Taza. She did not touch him. She only stood near enough that he could feel her warmth in the cold dark. The cave grew darker as the last gray light failed outside. The sound of running water filled the silence, steady, unhurried, indifferent. Nana turned slowly. He stepped out into the fading day. His silhouette lingered a moment against the opening, then was gone. Taza listened to the hoofbeats fade, then return, then fade again. Searching. He looked at Clara. She reached out fingers brushing his arm where the new wound still seeped. She said nothing. He took her hand in his once brief, then let go. The darkness closed in, and the water kept running, carrying the echo of strangers' steps deeper into stone that had never known them before. The cave held the night longer than the world outside. Gray light filtered through high cracks in the ceiling, thin as spider silk, barely enough to show the sheen on the underground stream. Taza stood alone at the water's edge, boots planted on wet stone. Behind him, Clara and Jed slept on the folded blanket, her arm curved protectively around the boy, even in unconsciousness. Their breathing was slow, even the only soft sound in the chamber, besides the steady drip from the seep. He knelt. The cold stone bit through his knees. He dipped his fingers into the pool, letting the water close over his skin. It was colder than he remembered, sharp enough to make the small cuts on his hands sting fresh. He held them there until the ache steadied, then lifted them, watching droplets fall back into the dark mirror below. He closed his eyes. A name rose in his throat. His grandfather's name, the one who had first brought him to this place as a child, who had knelt just here and taught him to listen to the water's voice. The name came out quiet, barely a breath more shape than sound. He spoke it once, then again, slower, as though testing whether the ancestors still answered. No echo returned. Only the drip patient indifferent. Taza opened his eyes. Nana had not moved from the entrance. The old man stood framed in the faint gray square of daylight staff planted between his feet, blanket draped loose over his shoulders. He had been there since the night before, silent, unmoving. Not guarding, not accusing, simply present. His face carried no anger, only the heavy weariness of a man who has seen too many lines crossed and knows the cost is always paid later. The regulators had gone quiet some time before dawn. No more hoofbeats, no more distant shouts. They had circled once more, then withdrawn, perhaps to gather others, perhaps to wait. The silence outside was worse than the noise. It meant they were thinking now, planning. Nana spoke without turning his head. The land has heard their steps. His voice was low, almost lost in the drip of water. It will not forget. Taza remained kneeling. He looked down at his reflection, distorted, broken by ripples. The wound on his shoulder throbbed in time with his pulse, a dull reminder of the blood he had already spilled on ground that did not belong to him. He felt the old words rise again, not spoken, but remembered. The quiet oath every boy made when he first took a man's name to keep the trails clean, to guard the springs, to carry the ancestors forward unbroken. It had never been said aloud. It lived in the blood, in the way a man walked the land, in the silence he kept when others spoke too much. Now that oath felt thinner, stretched, like hide left too long in the sun. Nana shifted his weight. The staff tapped once, soft against stone. If they stay, the water will turn bitter. The game will leave. The people will have to move before the next hard winter. Taza lifted his head. He looked at the old man for a long moment. I know. The admission came out flat final. No defense, no plea. Nana's eyes did not waver. Then you know what must be done. Taza rose slowly. Water dripped from his fingers, pattering into the pool. He turned toward the back of the cave where Clara stirred. Her eyes opened slow, heavy with sleep, and the weight of everything unsaid. She sat up carefully, careful not to wake Jed. The boy remained curled thumb near his mouth, small chest rising and falling. Clara looked at Taza, then passed him to Nana. She said nothing. She only reached for Jed's blanket and pulled it higher over his shoulders. Taza crossed the chamber. His steps were deliberate, each one heavier than the last. He stopped a few paces from them. "I will take them out of the cave," he said to Nana, voice low enough that only the old man could hear. Nana shook his head once slow. "Not out of the cave," he said. "Out of the land." The words fell like stones into the pool, sending slow ripples across the surface. Taza stood motionless. He felt the cave press in closer, the damp air, the faint mineral smell, the cold that seeped from the walls. He looked back at Clara. She had risen to her feet now, Jed still asleep against her leg. Her hand rested on the boy's head, fingers light in his hair. She met Taza's eyes. No question, no demand, only waiting. He looked down at his hands. The water had washed away the dust, but not the bloodstains, dark crescents under his nails, faint streaks on his palms. Marks that would not fade. He turned back to Nana. The old man had not moved. The carved staff caught the weak light symbols, seeming to shift as though breathing. Taza exhaled once slow. Then he stepped toward Clara. His hand found hers, brief, firm. He did not squeeze. He only held. She looked down at their joined hands, then up at his face. Nana watched. The cave remained silent except for the drip, the soft breathing of the sleeping boy, the faint wind that found its way through the cracks high above. Taza released her hand. He turned toward the entrance, but his feet carried him back to Clara instead. Nana's head lowered a fraction. Not in defeat, in acceptance of what had already been decided. The gray light strengthened, creeping farther into the chamber. And the water kept running unchanged, carrying the faint echo of a name spoken once and never answered again. The afternoon sun slanted low across the open ground, before the camp turning the grass to pale gold and the dust to fire. Taza emerged from the cave mouth, last stepping into the open air, as though the darkness still clung to his shoulders. Clara walked ahead with Jed's hand in hers. The boy's steps faltered only once, then steadied when he saw the figures waiting. They had come out without warning. Warriors stood in a loose half-circle bows, unstrung, but held ready faces carved from the same stone as the cliffs behind them. Women gathered at the edges, blankets pulled tight, children held close. No one spoke. The wind moved through the sage, carrying the faint scent of piñon smoke from distant fires. It was not a welcome. It was a reckoning. Nana waited at the center staff, planted in the earth. The carved symbols caught the dying light eagle wing bare paw, the unbroken spiral of lineage. His blanket hung loose gray hair braided with a single eagle feather that stirred, once then stilled. Taza stopped a dozen paces short. Clara halted beside him. Jed pressed against her leg, eyes wide, taking in the circle of strangers who looked nothing like the men who had burned the wagons. No one moved to greet them. No one moved to harm them. The silence was the weapon. Taza felt the eyes of his people settle on him, not with rage, but with the quiet weight of recognition. They had seen the tracks. They had smelled the foreign scent on the wind. They knew. He stood straight, shoulders level, hands open at his sides. He did not speak first. He did not need to. Nana lifted the staff a fraction, then let it fall back to the ground. The soft thud carried farther than any shout. "You have brought them here," he said. The words were not loud. They did not need to be. Taza met the old man's gaze. No denial, no plea, only the steady breath of a man who had already chosen. Clara's hand found his. Fingers laced through his small but firm. He felt the warmth of her palm, the faint tremor she could not quite hide. He did not pull away. He held. The wind rose sharper, whipping dust across the open ground. It tugged at blankets, at hair, at the feathers in the warrior's braids. The land itself seemed to lean in, listening. Nana's eyes moved to Clara, then to Jed. The boy stared back, unafraid in the way only children can be when they have already seen worse. The land remembers, Nana said. It has tasted their steps. The springs will speak of it. The game trails will shift. We cannot keep what has been broken. One of the younger warriors shifted bow, creaking in his grip, but Nana raised a hand. The movement stopped. Taza felt the words settle into him like lead. He had known this moment would come since the first arrow left the bow at the wagons. Every step after had led here to this patch of earth under the slanting sun. Nana lowered his hand. The man who walks with outsiders no longer walks with us. The declaration was quiet. Final. No anger in it, only truth. A murmur rippled through the circle, soft, brief, then gone. No one raised a weapon. No one shouted. The warriors simply stood, bows lowered, now faces unreadable. The women drew children closer. The wind carried the sound of distant drums from another camp, faint like a memory. Taza looked at Nana, then at Clara. He released her hand for a single heartbeat, long enough to feel the absence like a wound, then took it again tighter. Nana watched the gesture. His head inclined, once slow. Then the ceremony is not for joining, he said. It is for witnessing the parting. He turned slightly, staff tapping, once against the ground. The drums started. Not the quick, joyful rhythm of celebration. Slow, heavy, each beat falling like a stone into deep water. The sound rolled across the open ground, low and deliberate, carrying the weight of farewell. Warriors stepped back, opening the circle wider. Women formed a second ring behind them. Children were hushed. The wind died for a moment, as though the land itself paused to listen. Taza stood where he was, Clara and Jed beside him. He did not look away from Nana. The old man's eyes held no hatred, only the sorrow of a man who has seen the line drawn and crossed, and knows the cost will be borne by all. The drums continued, slow, unyielding. Clara's fingers tightened in Taza's. Jed looked up at him, small face solemn as though he understood more than words could hold. Taza did not speak. He only stood. The sun dropped lower, stretching their shadows long across the dust. And the drums kept falling, marking the end of one thing, the beginning of nothing certain. The sun bled low across the western rim, painting the valley in long streaks of rust and shadow. Taza stood on the high ledge overlooking the camp, a dozen paces from the nearest lodge. Clara held Jed close beside her, the boy's small frame tucked against her side. They did not stand together as one unit. The distance between them and the camp was deliberate, measured in more than steps. The wind moved across the open ground, carrying the faint scent of pinon smoke downward, then upward again, as though the land itself exhaled. No one approached. Warriors remained at the edge of the lodges, arms folded, faces turned away. Women watched from doorways, blankets drawn tight. Children were kept inside. The camp went about its evening tasks, tending fires, skinning game, mending without haste or glance in their direction. The silence was not hostile. It was final. Taza looked down into the valley. Smoke rose thin from the cooking fires, curling like gray threads into the darkening sky. The familiar shapes of the lodges, the corrals, the worn paths between them, all of it lay below, unchanged, except for the space he no longer occupied. He felt the absence like a missing limb, Not pain, yet only the dull knowledge that something once there was gone. A young warrior approached from the side, not close enough to speak, only near enough to be seen. He led Taza's horse by a rawhide lead. The animal walked steady head low, saddle empty. The warrior stopped at the edge of the ledge, dropped the lead, then turned without a word and walked back toward the lodges. The horse stood where it was left, ears flicking once at a distant sound. Taza did not move to take the reins. Not yet. Clara's hand rested on Jed's shoulder. The boy stared down at the camp, eyes wide, taking in the fires, the shadows of people moving between them. He had not spoken since they left the circle. His small fingers twisted in the hem of Clara's skirt knuckles white. The silence had found him too deeper than fear, a quiet that settled in the bones. Taza touched the new scar on his shoulder. The wound from the regulators had closed. Rough, puckered a raised line under his shirt. He felt it now pressing against the fabric with every breath. Clara's hands bore their own marks. Calluses thickened along her palms from gripping reins, from tearing cloth for bandages, from holding on when there was nothing else to hold. Jed carried no visible scar, but the stillness in him spoke of something broken inside, the way a child learns too soon that quiet is safer than sound. Taza looked at the valley again. He strained to hear the old things, the low murmur of ancestors in the wind, the faint call of his grandfather's name carried on the breeze. Nothing answered. Only the wind, empty now. The ground beneath his feet felt colder than it should, as though the warmth had been drawn out and taken below. Nana stood far off on another outcrop, a dark shape against the red sky. Two women flanked him, blankets pulled over their heads. They did not come closer. They only watched. Nana's staff rested against his shoulder. The carved symbols caught the last light, then dimmed. Taza turned to Clara. She met his eyes. No words passed between them. She only nodded once, small, certain. He stepped closer. His hand rose slow, deliberate, not to embrace, not to claim. He leaned forward until their foreheads touched light, steady the old gesture of farewell among his people, when parting was forever. No kiss, no promise. Only the press of skin-to-skin breath mingling for a single long moment. Her hair smelled of dust and sage, and the faint soap she had carried from another life. His carried the mineral tang of the cave, the iron of dried blood. He felt her tremble, once then steady. He drew back. "I will take you to the boundary," he said. The words came out low, rough from disuse. Clara swallowed. A tear traced the dust on her cheek. She did not wipe it away. She only nodded again. Jed looked up at them both, then down at the valley. His small hand reached for Taza's, hesitant, then firm. Taza let the boy take it. The grip was light, trusting, final. The wind rose again, sharper now, carrying the scent of smoke farther away. Taza turned toward the horse. He lifted Jed first, settling the boy in front of the saddle, then reached for Clara. She took his hand, swung up behind arms, going around the boy to hold him steady. Taza mounted last, settling into place. The horse shifted under the added weight, then stood quiet. He looked once more at the camp below. Fires glowed brighter now against the coming dark. Voices drifted up low, ordinary, the sound of people continuing without him. Nana remained on his distant ledge. He did not raise a hand. He did not speak. He only watched staff still at his side, the carved symbols fading into shadow. Taza turned the horse north. They moved off the ledge down the narrow trail that led away from the valley. The ground fell away behind them, the camp growing smaller, the fires dimmer. The wind followed, carrying nothing now, no name, no memory, only dust. And somewhere in the silence between them the parting was complete. The first light of dawn crept over the eastern rim, pale and thin, touching the red rock with no warmth. Taza stood alone on the narrow ledge that marked the boundary Apache land behind him, the open flats of settler country stretching north ahead. The wind rose slow from the valley, carrying the faint, clean scent of sage and dust that had not yet been trampled by iron shoes or wagon wheels. Clara and Jed were already moving. She walked ahead, one hand steady on the boy's shoulder, the other holding the lead of the horse Taza had given them. Jed kept pace, small boots kicking up little puffs of red earth. They did not look back. Not once. Taza watched them go. The distance grew with each step 20 paces, 30 more, until their shapes softened against the pale horizon. Clara's hair caught the light for a moment, a brief flash of chestnut, then faded into the haze. Jed's small figure stayed close to her side, never straying, as though he understood the leaving was final. The wind moved through Taza's hair, lifting the loose strands, tugging at the feathers braided there. It felt the same as always, dry, relentless, carrying no message. He listened for the old things, anyway. The low call of his grandfather's name, the faint rhythm of ancestors walking the trails behind him. Silence answered. The land had withdrawn its voice. It had remembered the stranger's steps, the blood spilled, the boundary crossed. No echo returned. He touched the scar on his shoulder, once rough, raised, permanent. The wound had healed clean, but the mark remained a line across skin that had once belonged to the people. Now it belonged only to him. Far below the camp lay quiet in the valley. Smoke rose straight from the lodges, thin and gray, carrying the scent of pignon and roasted meat. Voices drifted up low ordinary, the sound of a day beginning without him. No one looked up towards the ledge. No one waved. The separation was complete. Nana stood on another outcrop half a mile distant, a dark silhouette against the rising light. The old man did not move. His blanket hung still, staff planted in the rock. He watched. That was all. No gesture of farewell, no raised hand, no word carried on the wind. Only the steady gaze of a man who carries memory forward when others cannot. Taza exhaled once slow. The breath stirred the dust at his feet. He could have followed. The horse was gone, but the trail north was open. He could walk it, catch them before the sun climbed high step into the world they were entering, a world of fences, towns, promises written on paper. He could leave the name he had carried, the blood that tied him to this ground, the silence that had always been his companion. He could choose them fully, or he could stay. The wind gusted harder, whipping red dust across the ledge. It stung his eyes, coated his tongue with the taste of iron and alkali. He did not blink. Clara and Jed grew smaller still. They reached a low rise, crested it, disappeared beyond. The horizon swallowed them clean. Taza stood a long moment longer. No regret rose in him. No joy, only the quiet certainty of a choice made when no other path remained. He had kept what he could, the boy and the woman lived. He had lost what he must, the land no longer knew his name. He turned. His moccasins made no sound on the rock as he stepped away from the ledge back toward the open desert that lay west and south country. His people had walked for generations, country that still held their tracks, even if it no longer spoke to him. He moved without hurry, without destination beyond the next rise, the next shadow. Not to die, to continue, to be Apache in the only way left alone, carrying the silence inside him like a stone smoothed by rivers long gone. Behind him the valley fell away, the smoke thinned, the voices faded. Nana remained on his distant rock, watching until the red dust rose in a slow curtain veiling the figure of the man who had once been one of them. The wind kept blowing. It carried nothing now, no name, no memory, no promise, only dust and silence. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for listening and for allowing this story to speak to your heart. The Wild West still holds countless truths, some painful, some tender, all worth remembering. Stay with us, subscribe, comment, and invite others to discover these untamed stories. From our hearts to yours, thank you for being part of this journey. Aviso legal bara disclaimer. Each story shared here is produced for storytelling enjoyment. Certain scenes may include fictional or dramatized elements inspired by historical circumstances. Although AI tools assist us in visuals narration and script development, the emotional tone, editing, and quality control are conducted by people to ensure meaningful experiences. We fully uphold YouTube's policies, using no deceptive recreations or impersonations of real individuals. All creative resources are properly licensed. Unauthorized copying, re-uploading, or remixing is not permitted. Thank you for supporting the effort behind every episode we create.